Welcome to the final video in the English pronunciation workshop from the American Language and Culture Center at Southern Utah University. In this video, we want to give a quick overview of English intonation patterns and also talk about the use of reductions in fluent English speech. Over this workshop, we talked about two main features of English pronunciation, both the segmentals, which are individual sounds from consonants and vowels, and suprasegmentals, which are pronunciation features that go beyond individual sounds to the word, sentence, and even the larger connected speech length. We've already talked about stress patterns in both words and sentences. We talked about rhythm, and now we'll talk about intonation. So what is intonation? Intonation is a change in the pitch of a voice over the course of a phrase or a sentence. Now, it's important to make a distinction between tone versus intonation. Some languages, tone plays a very important part in communicating meaning and making distinctions even between segmentals. For example, in the Chinese language, tone with vowels can change the vowel, and it becomes a different vowel, whether it's rising or falling or rising and falling. But English doesn't use tone in this way to change meaning. Generally, English uses intonation, which is a pitch change over a phrase or a sentence. So it's important to think about intonation in terms of maybe different levels. We sort of have a level 2, which is sort of our normal. We have a level 1, which is low, and we have a level 3, which is high. And most language is happening at level 2, but we have shifts to level 3 or level 1, depending on whether we're trying to show a rise or a fall. And so falling intonation is the general pattern in English, where we're somewhere around maybe a 2, and then by the end of the sentence, we've dropped to a 1. And sometimes there's a bit of a rise right before the drop. So most statements in English use the falling intonation pattern. And this pattern signals confidence in the statement. It signals completion of an idea. We also use this with WH questions. And so there is the idea, maybe in English, that all questions are rising intonation, the other pattern. But that's not the case with WH questions. WH questions also use a falling pattern. And part of the reason perhaps for this is that WH questions already very clearly signal that they're a question with the WH word: who, what, where, why, when, or how. And so we maybe perhaps don't need that rising intonation pattern at the end to show that it's a question, because the WH question word is doing the question signaling for us quite clearly. Let's look at some examples. The first one is a statement. The appointment is at 12 o'clock. The appointment is at 12 o'clock. And so we sort of get maybe a little bit of a rise before we get to the bottom, but ultimately this is overall a falling intonation pattern. And so this is normal for most statements in English. Now our next one here is a WH question. Who will present at the conference tomorrow? Who will present at the conference tomorrow? And we get that drop at the end. And so that's the pattern that we use, the falling intonation pattern, when we have a WH question. Same thing with the when question. When does the meeting end? When does the meeting end? And we drop at the end there. So this is the normal pattern for most statements in English and for WH questions. And when we end with that falling, the listeners generally know that we're done speaking. And so that's another feature of the falling intonation pattern. It signals we've come to the end. Rising intonation pattern, on the other hand, signals doubt. So it signals that the speaker is not confident in the information they're sharing. So we can use this pattern to turn a grammatical statement into a question. So even though all the words and the word order would signal that it's a statement, if we apply rising intonation to it, then we're changing what looks like a statement into a question. We also use this with yes/no questions as well. Now, another feature of the rising intonation pattern, or another use of it, is to show that the speaker wishes to continue speaking. They're not finished yet. So we will do this often with lists. When you're listing many things, you use a rising pattern to show that the list is not finished. We need to keep going until you get to the end, and then you drop. We also use this often when we are telling a story in English, when we have not completed maybe a story or a presentation or an argument, and we want to signal to the readers, do not interrupt me. I am not finished speaking yet. And so that rising intonation pattern shows it's not finished. I can't be interrupted. You need to pay attention and keep listening. So here we have a sentence that would grammatically be a statement. You don't have time to meet with me. But we can turn this into a question without changing the grammar, simply by changing the intonation. You don't have time to meet with me? And that rising me signals that there's doubt. Does the computer work? Okay, this is a yes/no question. And when we use that rising pattern at the end, we're signaling that we have doubt about the veracity or the truthfulness of the statement. Now, I have a WH question here, and we said that WH questions generally have a falling intonation pattern. But if you were asking for clarification on using a WH question, so you had received an answer and you didn't quite believe it or you didn't quite hear it, then you might rephrase it with maybe emphatic stress on the WH word and a rising pattern at the end. So normally I might ask the question, when does the meeting end? And someone says something, but maybe there's background noise and I didn't hear it. And I said, when does the meeting end? And now I've got a rising intonation pattern. When does the meeting end? When does the meeting end? And so I'm showing I have more doubt. I didn't quite understand. I need more information. That's when we might see a rising intonation pattern used. Here's another one, tag questions. Okay, when we use rising intonation at the end of a tag question, we're showing to the listener that we really don't quite believe what's happening, and that we're really questioning it. She's working, isn't she? I'm really doubting, like, surely she should be working, right? But she's not. But if I were to instead to use a falling intonation pattern with that tag question, she's working, isn't she? In that case, I believe it's already true. And I'm just asking you to confirm it, but I don't have a lot of doubt. I'm pretty confident that it's already true. So that's where we can see the difference between a rising and a falling intonation pattern with a tag question having a different meaning with the speaker and the listener. Okay, falling pattern means I'm pretty confident, I'm just checking. Rising intonation pattern means I really don't know, and this is why I'm asking. Next, we have a list. So let's pick up some juice, some milk, and a pie. So some juice, some milk, and a pie, and then dropping. So here we see the rising intonation pattern functioning to show that we're not finished with the list. And we might see the same thing when someone is giving a longer description or a series of connected sentences. It could be part of a story or a description or an argument. I may be relating an experience I had. And then I said, and then we visited the museum and we met the museum director, and she was very helpful. And she showed us some interesting artifacts, and it was a really great day. Then I drop at the end, that last one, because I've finished with my story and I'm signaling to my audience, I'm done sharing this. But I kept using the rising intonation pattern, even though it was all of these were statements. But I did that because I'm trying to signal to my listeners, don't interrupt me, hold on, keep listening. I'm not finished with my explanation. So those are some other ways that rising intonation pattern are used to show doubt and to show that something's not finished. The speaker needs to continue. So let's move on from intonation now and talk about reductions. Sometimes we call this ellipsis. And these could be defined as reduced or dropped vowel sounds on unstressed syllables. Now, we've talked for a while now about stress patterns in English and stressed syllables and unstressed syllables, and that many multisyllabic words in English tend to have one syllable that is strongly stressed and may have one or more syllables that are unstressed. And when this happens, sometimes one or more of those syllables may almost appear or sound to disappear. So here is an example, the word favorite. Favorite, that first syllable receives the primary stress. And because of that, the second syllable is quite weak. And it's so weak that most native speakers of English, when they're speaking fluently, will not say favorite, but say favorite. And they drop that middle sound. So it gets reduced from sort of an or to maybe a schwa, like a and then just a, it's gone. Favorite. The word probably, stressed on the first syllable, probably, okay, but it can be reduced to probably. And the second syllable is gone again. Same thing with general. Stress on the first syllable, that second syllable may be reduced to the point where it disappears, general. Again, with business. Okay. It looks like there's 3 working vowels there, but because the stress is on the first, that second one could be reduced so much that we don't hear it. Business instead of business, business. Memory instead of memory, memory. Margarine instead of margarine. Florida instead of Florida. And vegetables instead of vegetables. Or sometimes native speakers just call them veggies and they shorten the word. So here are some others. If you'd like, you could pause the video and you could practice pronouncing these words, identifying where the primary stress is, and then making a guess at where an English speaker might reduce and maybe drop an unstressed vowel sound. I'll go ahead now and pronounce these words and see if you can identify which syllable receives the unstressed sound and which syllable then is dropped. Conference, average, suppose, interesting, family, camera, evening, practically. When I teach students about these patterns, I don't necessarily expect them to drop the syllables, but I want them to get good at recognizing which syllable receives the stress so that they can better understand why these words may be pronounced differently than the way they expect them on the page. And that better prepares their listening skills. And some students then get more comfortable and they can actually follow this pronunciation pattern in their own speech. But that's not the primary goal. For me, the primary goal is to help improve their listening skills so that they'll recognize that when someone says camera, they really mean camera, but they have reduced that middle syllable. So in this video, we talked about intonation patterns in English and said that falling intonation patterns is the standard pattern for English pronunciation. We use it primarily with statements and to signal confidence and completion with what we've said. We also use it with WH questions. Then rising intonation pattern is used in English to show doubt, that we don't quite believe or we have questions about what we are saying. We also use rising intonation pattern to signal to listeners that something is not complete and that there's more information to come. And lastly, we talked about reductions. When we have a multisyllabic word and have some unstressed syllables, it's possible those unstressed syllables could be said so quickly, so weakly, so quietly that they seem to disappear from the word. And so the word appears to be reduced in the number of syllables that it produces. And this can be helpful at raising students' awareness of the disconnect from what they think a word should be pronounced and the way English speakers may actually pronounce it in fluent speech. I hope that this workshop series has helped you better understand the connection between English spelling, English pronunciation and speaking, will help you and your students be better readers, writers, listeners, and speakers.